welcome to Time in the Studio, and thank you for being here. This is a supportive space for earth-loving creatives who want to dig in and flourish. And I'm your host, Sarah Marie Miller. I'm an artist, herbalist, and doula based in Boulder, Colorado. I had so much fun with this chat. It was about a year ago, actually, and finally releasing it with my friend LEXI CHATARA-MIDDLETON. We are both part of a really wonderful doula collective based in Boulder called Sage Birth and Wellness, and she does really beautiful somatic counseling and movement therapy with people and families here, especially supporting people who have experienced traumatic or difficult birth experiences. And I think part of that passion comes from her own experience having her son 2 months early in the NICU. And so she just saw there's such a need to serve those families. We get into that story a little bit. We also talk about postpartum anxiety and insomnia, somatic therapy and tracking sensations in the body, just bringing more awareness to our feelings and using movement and how stories kind of get lodged in our bodies and how movement can kind of help shift that. We also talk about how the postpartum time can be rough on relationships and ways to overcome that, and talk about self-care, sex after birth, and play, sexual play without intercourse. And it's just, it's a really fun, beautiful conversation that I really enjoyed. And I think it's relevant for this time. And I see, it could be really supportive for families who are, and couples who are experiencing new babes in their world, and also just to think about different ways we can love each other and be connected to each other. So I think you're going to like it. Please be sure to connect with me over on Instagram at Time in the Studio Podcast. And if you love the show, please feel free to share it with a friend or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or you can become a patron on Patreon. And I'm ever so grateful to the people there who are supporting. Also, big shout out to Aaron Travers for the show music. Okay, let's get into it. Cha-cha-cha. I'd love to just start with, who are you? How do you describe your work?
Well, so I'm LEXI, and I am a dance movement therapist. I also often refer to myself as a somatic psychotherapist. Nice. I'm a member of Sage, and I found my way to Sage via Amy. I was posting on some parent groups, mom groups, about my practice, my developing practice, and she saw them and reached out and said, will you please be a part of the collective?
And what's the name of your practice and your website?
LEXI CHATARA-MIDDLETON, and I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Colorado and also a registered dance movement therapist. And my practice is called Spacious Ground Counseling, and it's spaciousgroundcounseling.com.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love your website. It's really gorgeous, and your writing is just so in-depth and really juicy. I feel like that's helpful for people as a resource to go to.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious, as a therapist, so do you have to work only with people in Colorado?
So everything has changed with COVID.
Okay.
So telehealth rules. So I did not do teletherapy prior to this. It was all in person. So that obviously people are in Colorado. But since COVID, I do have a couple out of state people that I work with, and basically all the rules regarding telehealth have been lifted because so many people are struggling, particularly right now. I mean, because we're also isolated and there's just a lot going on in the world.
I'm so glad the rules were lifted for that, because I think that makes so much more sense to be able to connect with the people that you feel you align with, rather than like the person who is maybe right there.
Yeah. And I think ideally, I mean, for me as a somatic psychotherapist, telehealth is challenging because I use my own body so much in picking up on perhaps what is happening with somebody else, or I use my eyes to observe what's happening non-verbally, and it's all just harder in many ways. There's things that are good about telehealth. So in person for me is ideal,
Yeah.
but it's just not the way it's going right now. So I'm happy to, and I've learned just tremendously about telehealth.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious if you have any suggestions. I know there are some counselors and people that do a lot of sessions, especially via phone now in different realms. Is there any advice you have for people for working Skype or via Zoom? Any suggestions you have for being able to still connect with people? Because I feel like that that in-person connection is just it's not as present for people right now. It's just such a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you just did, a grounding exercise, making it sacred, because there's something about going to specifically a therapist, and there's something about the office, the space that sets the
Mm.
tone and is the literal container for what's going to happen in the session. So if that's not present, I think it's important to have some kind of ritual around creating like the sacred therapeutic space.
Mm.
For me, I mean, I work with a lot of moms, and sometimes the moms have children with them, which is another challenge. But and everybody's in their home, so I always ask the question about privacy. Do you feel like you have a room where you can really talk openly and freely? Perhaps have space to lay on the ground or move around, because I do movement with people that are willing and able to do that. So, but yeah, some breathing, just grounding, similar to what you do, acknowledging, coming together so that it doesn't feel like you're just FaceTiming a friend, because it's
Mhm.
different.
Yeah.
So something to set that apart. And I try to keep my space clean and light and bright and uplifted. And I'm very conscious of what people see, not in terms of hiding things, but so that it feels like a therapeutic space.
Mhm.
And I would encourage anybody, if they're seeing a therapist in particular or doing therapy, to have an intention around their space.
Mm. That's such a beautiful offering, and I feel like it makes so much sense, and I can see pros and cons to meeting online rather than in person because I feel like sometimes people can be more at ease. And I know a couple therapists who they'll do like intros with video, but then they go to just audio. And so the person doesn't get so wrapped up in what they see,
Mm.
but they can just really kind of be in their body more and just use the audio to kind of guide them in some ways. So I think
Hmm.
I can see some advantages in some ways, especially if you're creating that sacred space and just really encouraging other people to make their space, their physical space sacred too. I love that idea.
Yeah. And then there's moments that are so personal,
Yeah.
like when you're seeing somebody nurse their baby, or because I work with a lot of mothers or parents to babies, I think that there's something about telehealth where I think it would be harder to get those people to take the time for themselves to come to therapy, to arrange childcare, to drive. When you have a new baby, you're exhausted,
Yeah.
you're tethered by if you're breastfeeding, or, it's just hard to get out. So there's something about telehealth that I think is useful, particularly for people that have infants. And then you get to see the moments, or somebody's partner walks in and they're like, "Hi, Lexi," or my dog comes in and is like sitting with me. It's just personal in a different way. And I do have moments with people where I, particularly around the movement and the body work, where I've seen people really let go and express in a different way. It depends. Sometimes that happens more in person, and then there's certain people, and I think that you're right, where the distance of it allows them to open up in a way. Like, I'm not that close. I can't see everything. Like, there's some space that allows people to feel safe enough to go there. Does that make
Mm,
sense?
absolutely. Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that. I love that you're working with a lot of new mamas too, because as a mother, I'm sure you can relate to people. And it sounds like you had a very profound experience for the birth of, sounds like your second child. I'm sure both experiences were incredibly profound. I'm curious, like, what has brought you to work with primarily women and moms, and what that's been like.
Yeah, so I should say right off the bat that I do work mostly with moms, people that identify as moms,
Mm.
but I also feel like in my practice, I really want to acknowledge the people that give birth that don't identify as moms. So I don't see those people as often, but I the idea of mama groups, or there is the sacredness around connecting with other moms and identifying yourself that way, and there's all these other folks that have babies in a different way or don't
Mhm.
identify as a mom but have given birth. So I just want to just plug that there's
Yes.
all the people that give birth, and so it's not just moms that I support, but anybody who is on the path to parenthood in any way, shape, or form. So just to say that, I like to say that just because it's important to me.
Yes. I thank you so much for naming that, because that's something that's just coming more and more into my consciousness and my reality, and just the world at large. I think it's
All
just
about
like we're
totally.
all trying to be more
Yep.
aware and conscious of the expansiveness of birth, and how anyone in that experience should be honored. And I like that you're saying not just moms. Is there any language within that or around that that you found to be helpful?
I try to say parents
Hmm.
because it doesn't denote gender.
Yeah,
So I try to say
that's
parents a lot, and I on my website that's what I try to say, or people who give birth.
that's clear. Yeah, that's
But
funny.
it's hard. It's really hard to break these ideas and patterns, and I mean it's in everything in the medical system. The medical system hasn't caught up yet. So I just imagine how that must feel to people that don't identify as a mother, when it's just so obviously the majority of people giving birth identify as a mother, but how that must feel when you don't. You're not
Yeah.
that person. So I just try to open it up to include all people.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm wanting to really work on that too. And parents is so simple and clear. And I'm also noticing a lot of language around partnership. And I think that's really important. But I also see like single moms or single people, single papas, or just single people who
Yeah.
are having birth experiences that I feel like that sometimes gets left out too. So I'm wanting to be more inclusive
Yeah.
with that as well.
Yes. I agree. I agree. And
Yeah.
yeah, I my son really put me on this path. So he's my firstborn, and he came 2 months early.
Oh,
Very, very,
wow.
very fast, in about 3 hours from
Wow.
start to finish. And just really rocked my world in terms of becoming a parent in such a critical moment. And he is healthy and strong and almost 5, and you would never know he was in the NICU for 6 weeks. But what I noticed was, first of all, that the parents in the NICU were really looked like, even their way they looked was just shock. Like, what just
Yeah.
happened? I'm sleep deprived. I can't hold my baby. The baby may or may not be having interventions, medical interventions. There's decisions to be made. It's just a wild way to become a
Yeah.
parent. And what I noticed in myself was, when your child is in the NICU and comes into the world that way, you're just in crisis mode. Like, you're just responding moment to moment to moment to moment. And I was so focused on that and helping him grow and having pumping around the clock so my milk would come in, and holding him and being there as much as I could to help him grow in that way and be healthy in that way, that when I got home, when my husband and I got home and things settled down, then I was just blasted with anxiety. And I think the critical nature of focusing on him and doing what I needed to do, that was helpful in keeping everything else at bay. And then when he wasn't critical, then it all just poured down on me, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I started thinking about other people. Okay. And then you're postpartum, and it's very isolating in terms of you may or may not be nursing. You can't leave. If you're nursing, you only have a certain amount of time you can leave your baby, or you have to pump, and you're home with a small child and they're sleeping all the time. You just can't get out in the world in the same way. And then to have that combined with just anxiety that I had with what had all just happened, I really got slammed. And so I started thinking about other people. You feel alone in it, right? Like you're nursing at 4 a.m. and you're feeling anxious and you're like, I'm the only person feeling this. And then you realize that not only are you not the only person feeling that, but there's probably people literally doing the exact same thing all over the world, feeling the exact similar. So that just really started me, as well as wanting to have a flexible schedule and really build something that I was passionate about. So that started me on a path of wanting to help parents who have experienced what I call difficult births. So that can really mean anything: premature birth, NICU stays, infertility issues, miscarriages, loss of a baby, grief, a lot of grief work, not being able to get pregnant in the way you thought, birth trauma, really scary births. And just so, that is really where my passion lies. And as a somatic psychotherapist, because birth is so physical and happens in the body, I could only talk about it so much until I needed to actually process it in the place that it happened. Especially in the NICU, when everything is so sensory based. There's alarms, there's sounds, there's other babies crying, there's parents crying. I really had to process my anxiety in my body. Could only just talk about it for so long, but it was being carried in me, manifesting in me. So that's why I think that the somatic work really lends itself to postpartum and birth processing in particular.
I know a little bit about somatic work and how emotions kind of get lodged in our body. I'd love to hear you talk about that experience and how do you work through it? How do you kind of play with that energy or notice it even to begin with?
Yeah. Well, for example, for me, I'll just use myself as an example and go from there. I experienced insomnia and what I call anxiety. And when I hear other people say the word anxiety, the first question I ask is, how do you know you're anxious? Because anxiety, or pretty much any feeling, happens in the body first. So I know I'm anxious because my shoulders are up here, up around my ears, my chest, my sternum is tight. My breathing is happening in my chest and not in my belly. My heart is racing. So those sensations, I then label anxiety. You could say the same thing for anything. Happiness, it's all based first in your body, and then your brain processes it and labels it. So the first thing I do with people is I basically help people practice tracking sensation. And it seems so easy, but most of us don't do it. We're talking all day, we're on our phones, we're on our computers, and to really stop and be in the present moment and follow what you're feeling in your body for most of us, is like a new thing. It's a mindfulness practice. You're using your body as the focus to bring your awareness into the present moment. So that's usually where I start with people, unless somebody already has mindfulness or movement practices and they're well versed in that language already. Then I can kind of skip that step and jump in to other things. But on a basic level, it looks like that. So if I'm helping somebody or myself work with anxiety, it's like describing what the sensations are and then potentially exploring it in different ways. Like, okay, let that grow. See if you can let that grow. Let that tight tension, that blackness that's roiling around in you, see if you can let it spread and see how long you can tolerate that. Or when you put your awareness on it, typically, if you allow yourself to do that, it changes very quickly because you're finally letting yourself feel it instead of do all the things to not feel it, make it go away. So that's step one, really, is owning and becoming aware of the body in a different way. And then it can grow up from there. So sometimes for people, there's movements that need to happen to move that energy or move those sensations out. So oftentimes with stuck energy, it's stuck because you haven't allowed the movement to sequence through. Let me think of an example. Like animals in when a bird hits a window, it falls to the ground, you always were told, don't pick it up or don't touch it. Did you hear that?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
And part of that is because the bird will often be stunned and then it will actually start to quiver and shake a little bit. Similar with a deer. If a deer gets frightened, its whole body will start shaking. And it's just the natural way that the animal is processing the event. But as humans, we don't do that. You get in a car accident, many of us can just override that physical need to get rid of what just happened. And we just make stories about it. We just immediately jump to the brain. So the movement piece, needing to sequence out, up and out, so it's not lodged and stuck, doesn't necessarily happen for all of us. So oftentimes there's a movement that needs to be developed if there's really stuck old energy. For instance, to bring it into a human example, if you've lost your baby, or if your baby was born prematurely, you weren't able to hold your baby for a long time. Sometimes the cradling motion or rocking motion, or letting yourself imagine that feeling, and then, so it's very organic. Like I'm rocking as we're talking. Obviously listeners can't see that, but it might develop into something more like moaning or crying because you're letting yourself complete what you didn't get to do. That's kind of an elaborate explanation.
Beautiful. I love that. I feel like hearing that is just so helpful. And I can just imagine people who have experienced some sort of difficult birth, even just listening to that and just rocking a little bit and just, kind of self-soothing and tuning into that story and maybe finding a new way to tell that story. I'm also interested in the way that different people in a birth can have such a different experience. Like sometimes the birthing person will feel like it was an amazing, successful birth. And then the partner is traumatized by it.
Totally.
And so I'm curious how, in working with relationships with people and postpartum relationships, is there anything you found for kind of coming to terms with those kind of disjointed stories of the same story? One birth, but so many different experiences of that one birth. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for people, for partners or couples who are wanting to find an alignment with that.
Yeah, I would say that I don't often see couples where they're where they're feeling a need to align until where that comes up, Sarah, is often if there was a traumatic birth and the couple is preparing to have a second or another one. There's a lot of fear. And I think you are really onto something in terms of partners, often doulas too, and birth workers too. If there's a traumatic situation, even if it's not that traumatic, but if it is, like if there's a hemorrhage, or I think the partners really hold fear for both of their loved ones, the baby and the person that they love.
Yeah.
And they're watching it in a way. For me, when I went into premature labor and I'm I'm having a baby, I knew in my gut that it was going to be okay. I knew it was early, but I knew we'd be in the NICU, but I just knew that I was fine. I walked myself straight out of the hospital. Like nothing happened. It was very weird. It's very dreamlike. But my husband was terrified. He was terrified for me because he just gets this call, like this is happening. And he was terrified for our son. So he really held the fear in a different way. And I was just in the moment with the pain. So that is helpful in some way.
Yeah.
So I see that come up when people are preparing to do it again for both partners. But I do feel very strongly that the postpartum period and beyond is just really, really hard on relationships. And I feel like I have I love to talk about sex. Like I could be a sex therapist too. It's something that I'm into and looking into. And, it's hard. It's hard to feel like yourself. And so it's hard to find a balance with your partner postpartum. I do a lot of work with couples around self-care. And I hate that term because it's so overused.
Yeah.
But I really do a lot of work with people around there's multiple things you need to take care of. You need to take care of yourself. You're responding to this baby and any other kids you might have. You need to take care of your relationship. So it's all these pockets that you really have to attend to, which can get exhausting. So I do a lot of work with people around how do you support your partner in taking care of themselves and how do they do it for you? So that essentially the couple is working together to help each other get the time that they need. And it can be small to allow them to feel human in a time where it's really hard to feel like a human.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, not just with a newborn, but I work with couples way down the road as well. And it still continues to be important. And the whole idea of sex postpartum and that is very interesting. And I get fired up about that topic as well.
Can we dive into that a little? Because I feel like that is so fascinating. And just to think of ways that partners can create space for one another, because I'm sure it's hard to get aroused or in the mood if you're, if you haven't showered or slept in days. So I think just having those little moments of just like self-preservation are really
totally
important.
Well, not to mention that something just huge just happened in your body. It happened vaginally, it could have happened with surgery. So you're recovering. And obviously there's that 6-week period that we all know about. But beyond that, especially if you're nursing or pumping, particularly the chest area, it's like, don't touch me there. Like I have something touching me there all the time. So that I hear that a lot. Also fear about pain, having sex for the first time, intercourse for the first time. And what I like to tell people, first of all, is several things, but this idea in straight couples that it's all about penetration, like that's the only thing you can do is not the case. Like in some ways, straight couples should take some tips from queer couples because there's all kinds of other stuff you can do. That's not the be all end all of sex. In fact, it often isn't for women. It's not as enjoyable as a lot of other things could be. So taking that off the table as the main event and asking couples to think about being playful in a different way and finding other things that feel good, but and also create that physical connection. So I encourage people to do a lot of that. And I also just do a lot of normalizing around, one person, if there's one person that, and this is in any kind of couple, is home with a child and feeding that child, you're looking in your kid's eyes, you're holding them, maybe you're nursing or bottle feeding, but you're being touched constantly. So in some way, the intimacy is there, you're just constantly intimate with this little being, and it's a different kind of intimacy, but that touch, the oxytocin of the eye gaze, that's being met for that person then.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the other person, if they're out working or whatever, isn't getting that. So they want to come home and they want to connect with their partner in that way. Whereas that partner who's been doing that all day long is like, no, actually what I want is to be alone. Like that's really what I want, is to not be touched. So it's hard. It's really hard. And one way I think you can work around that or help that is the partner can support the partner who's been home all day in getting some alone time and being alone, so that there's space enough to feel that desire to come up again. Like if you're never not by yourself, there's no room or space for that desire. But if you can even get small moments, then it allows for that to start bubbling up again, essentially.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Oh my God, absolutely. That makes so much sense. And I could see how it would be beneficial for the partner who isn't with the babe all day to have that connection with the babe, and then have the person who is there all day have a little space, and then there's more excitement at coming back together as well. Another thing I'm kind of curious about is I've seen partnerships where one partner, once the baby is born, they don't feel like they're getting enough attention, and it's no longer all about them. I'm wondering if there's any suggestions in reckoning with that, the blow to the ego of like, wait, it's not all about me anymore. There's a baby. What?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first word that pops into my head hearing you say that is grief. Like you almost have to grieve what your former life was like. I find for myself and for people I work with that if you try to make it be how it was, you just feel like you're failing or missing something. Whereas if you can allow yourself to feel like, wow, that is gone. Like that was then. This is now. And I am really kind of sad about that. Like just naming it, like, yes, it's great you have a kid. Yes, it's beautiful, joyful. What a blessing. And there's things that are really hard and that things that you no longer get to do, especially with your one-on-one time with your partner. If that's how you're having a baby, you know, if you have a partner, and if you don't have a partner, you still have to grieve. It's like I think naming it and really allowing yourself to feel it rather than chugging through and saying all the things that we say about, yes, but we're so lucky. And yes. And it's also true that you're letting go of this former life. So I think naming it and talking about that with your partner is really useful. Like, what do you miss about before we had kids? Or remember that time where we went to the yurt and we slept till 11 and we got up and drank coffee and didn't have anything to do. And man, I really meant, like, just naming it and talking about it with your partner and allowing them to do the same is really helpful, because then you don't feel alone. And I think a lot of people feel guilt about having these feelings of missing that life. And so if you can talk about it with your partner or with a friend who has experienced parenting, then you're just normalizing it and naming it. And then the hard work is, like I said, is tending to yourself, tending to your child, tending to your relationship. And they all take work, and I think you have to be really intentional to set that aside, and it doesn't look the same. So I think when people hear the word self-care, they think, okay, I have to go get a massage, or I'm going to go to yoga class, or it can bring up ideas of what self-care looks like. And self-care can really be as simple as, I need 10 minutes in the morning to not talk to somebody, to be quiet with myself, and to drink my cup of coffee and stare at nothing. Like it could look like that. Like I just need those 10 minutes and then I'm ready for the day. Or I really need one night a week to not put the baby down. Can you put the baby down one night a week? Or whatever it is that you really know that you need it can be small. It can be so small. It doesn't have to look big. And it can't look big in the beginning, you know? And then also asking your partner, what do you need? How can I help you? So that both people are staying, you know, especially when you first have a newborn, it's really hard to do that. But if you can let your partner go for a walk around the block or have some quiet by themselves, then it's amazing how much two people can handle and get through and not sleep through if you're helping each other in that way.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm curious, in your experience in the NICU, if you have any suggestions for parents that might be in that situation. Is there anything that really helped you through that time?
I mean, well, I have my family's in Colorado, so I had lots of people, and I tried my best to accept help. What helped me? I was fortunate to have my son in May, so I was able to get outside. I mean, I would walk. Just, you know, you're sitting. I wanted to be so available to him and do as much what they call skin to skin or kangaroo care as possible. But I also had to get out of the hospital. So I did a lot of walking just around Good Samaritan, and that was very, very helpful. I think what I would tell myself, or what I know now looking back, is that it was a really crazy way to become a parent. It was a really crazy way to become a parent. And if it's not your first baby, it's still a crazy way to become a parent to another child. And so having some gentleness around what could unfold after, and just this idea of letting go of control. And that's really what I learned from it, Sarah, and what I think that is often what I help people work through in therapy, particularly around birth, is that you cannot control anything. So it's a constant process of letting go, you know, working with the body and feeling sensation and feeling breath in the present moment is a way to practice that. Because anytime you feel something or have a thought, it's going to change. Everything changes. So it's a constant practice of noticing, letting go, noticing, oh, it shifts, letting go. So mindfulness really, I mean, that's what meditation is for me. Meditation is not about not thinking or having, you know, this idea that you have these moments where you're in some kind of utopia where you're blissful, and there's moments of that can happen. But for me, it's really a practice in, there's working with my mind. The moments where nothing is happening, I am not thinking, are so rare and few and far between. It's really about, there's that thought again. I'm noticing it. I'm labeling it. I'm not attaching to it, and I'm letting it go. Just like a cloud, you know, passing in the sky, it's going to shift and change. So you realize that everything is impermanent, which can feel really scary, that you can't control everything and nothing's permanent. But if you go into birth, if you go into raising a child with that, rather than clinging to some idea of it's going to go this way, or it has to go this way, or I'll be devastated if it doesn't go this way, and then into parenting where you realize you really don't have any control. You can do some things, but that's what my son taught me. This is how to let go of how I wanted things to be.
Yeah. I can't even imagine the shock and just the surprise of having a baby 2 months early. I mean, you definitely, I would think you would just kind of kind of think of this journey of okay, I have 2 more months. And then all of a sudden you're in labor. That would be just so shocking. And such a just wake up to the moment and learning to be present in the moment. That's wild. It's such a journey.
Well, and I think it's grief. There's a grief in that too for a lot of people, where you think that there's 2 months left. You have 2 months more of being pregnant, of that experience. You have however much more time of preparing your house, preparing your mind. And with traumatic birth, two, it's like it can be such that, this thing is in you and then all of a sudden it's not. And that can be very startling. Or not being able to hold, most, you see these beautiful pictures of parents holding their babies right after birth, not being touched. And if you don't get that experience, how do you grieve that and acknowledge that and then repair that? A lot of people, especially in Boulder, have a lot of strong opinions about birth and how it should go, or that baby needing that contact, and sometimes it's not possible. So how then do you bond later down the road? And that's really my high dream, Sarah, is to work with parents and babies together and repairing some of that initial attachment stuff. Like, I would love to work in a NICU with families. I think that would be interesting. I don't know how that would be possible, but
I'm curious what you envision that looking like, or what that feels like potentially for the child. Like, there's this idea that the way that we're born into this world has an imprint on our consciousness. And, like, maybe if we're born via C-section, maybe we're like, it's just kind of jarring and traumatic for the baby to just suddenly be like lifted out of this body. So I'm curious what, I don't know, just about that experience and how to heal that connection, and what that, I just want to hear more about that, because that seems really interesting.
And I'm not an expert. A lot of what I do, or what I might say, is just like my gut instinct. But for instance, in the NICU, they encourage you to do a lot of kangaroo care or skin to skin. And there's scientific research on why that helps a baby grow and get healthier sooner, and why it's important just for a regular newborn as well. I mean, it literally helps neurons fire and grows the brain. But in the NICU, they want you to do that a lot because it helps the baby heal, essentially. And it's helping to form that initial attachment. Also helps the mother's milk to come in, because if your body's not ready to make milk, you just need a little extra boost with that. But for me, what I imagine it could look like is helping. It's a traumatic event, right? The baby wasn't ready, the parent wasn't ready. So explaining what's literally happening for the baby's brain and the mother's brain, or the person's brain, in that moment of skin to skin, and bringing awareness around it. Like, I would imagine, for instance, if I'm there and a mom is holding, or a person is holding their baby for the first time. So you're covered in wires. There's often a nasal cannula, IVs. Okay, what does it feel like as this baby's coming into your arms? Notice your thoughts. Is there fear? Yes, the baby's too small, or there's all these wires, I'm not sure how to hold them. Okay, let that happen. That is legitimate. Bring the baby to your chest. What are you noticing now? I'm feeling teary. Let the tears come. You're holding your baby for the first time, and just helping them track sensation in the moment. And then later down the road, because there are things that can happen with premature babies developmentally. Babies can be asthmatic down the road, or some babies will need to have OT or PT, and helping the parent, explaining to parents why that is, and helping them do it. Also, help talking parents through making that eye contact. Now there's phones, which is so challenging, so easy to pick up your phone, myself included. But because you didn't get that initial contact, how do you make it now? How do you be present for your baby in certain intentional moments? You can't do it all the time. Nobody can. And how are you holding? Is there fear? Is there anxiety? And just tracking in the body in the present moment, and supporting parents and explaining the neuroscience behind it, I think would be helpful. And what I craved, I realized I have this education, so I kind of know, but I'm also in a state of distress. So, but a lot of people don't have that background of knowing, the right brain to right brain attachment connection, and how important that is. And also for postpartum healing, when you're looking at baby in the eyes, there's a lot of oxytocin that's released, and that can be really helpful in working with postpartum depression. And, if you're feeling depressed, you're not going to want to make eye contact all the time. But if
right.
like a catch-22, if you do, it can actually help boost the good feelings. So it's a catch-22.
That's so
that was just off the cuff. So
that's great. No, that's super helpful. I'm curious. I don't know much about right brain to right brain. What is that? What is that about?
I have to remember all this stuff. So basically, your right brain is the part of your brain that is more nonverbal and emotional based. So there's parts of the brain that are more fully formed when you're born, and then the more executive cognitive functioning is coming on later. So right brain to right brain is the emotional attachment connection. So in attachment theory, I'm talking about the foundation that's laying down, that is being laid between a baby and their primary caretaker, that basically sets you up for how you're going to engage or feel in relationship for the rest of your life. So there's all these studies done. There was one, I can't remember the name of it, but you probably, if you took Psych 101, you probably heard it, of all these babies that were in, I think, a orphanage in Russia, perhaps somewhere in Eastern Europe. And they would be in these bassinets. And the baby that was down at the end of the line, in a longitudinal study, they discovered that baby had a lot more trouble, both mental health and physical trouble, than the babies that were in the front. And the reason for that is the babies in the front were held more often because the nurses would start there. And by the time, their shift is ending or they're getting tired, and the babies at the end would get less time being held. And there was effects of that. Long-term effects. So that's kind of the basis of attachment. How are you responding? And again, it's not about responding perfectly every time. And that's another thing that comes up endlessly. Like, none of us can be perfect. And you cannot respond to a baby's squeal or cry perfectly 100% of the time. It just isn't possible. So there's a term in psychotherapy called the good enough mother. I could change it to the good enough parent, which is the idea that you're meeting the needs of your baby, of your child, consistently enough that they feel safe and secure and know that they will be tended to if they are crying out.
I love that. That's because I feel like it can be really challenging for new parents. They want to attend to every cry, and it's like sometimes you can't always be there for every cry as much as you want to be. And so I think I love that permission, good enough. Like, do they feel loved and supported in general, the general tone of the relationship?
Totally. And it's the same with this whole, there's so many people that feel devastated when they can't nurse, or if your milk never comes in, or if your milk dries up, or if it's simply something that you don't want to do or can't do. People feel a tremendous amount of guilt. And I always tell people that it's not about, sure, you could say that there's people that agree, that think breast milk is better, or it has boost immunity. There's science on formula and breast milk, but really it's not about that. It's about how you're attuning to your child in a consistent way where they feel like somebody's got them. So it's not about what you're feeding them. It's about how you're attuning, and are you noticing their signals? Are you looking into their eyes? Are you mimicking their facial expressions? And then they start doing the same. And again, it's not 100% constant. In fact, there's a time and a place for locking yourself in a room and crying yourself while your baby's crying. I mean, that.
Thank you for naming that about lactation situations, because I think that can be really traumatic and emotional for a lot of people if their milk production doesn't look how they envisioned it looking. And so I think just naming that, like, if they feel loved in general, I think that's so beautiful. I'm curious, you talked about how the eye gazing and the skin to skin can help the milk come in. I'm curious if you have any other experiences or suggestions with things that could help with milk production potentially.
Oh man, I mean, I'm sure that you probably know my full support. Like Liz Philbrick,
Uh-huh.
who
Oh,
is
yes.
on stage, she made me nursing tea, and I had friends
Okay.
make me lactation cookies. But you know, sleep, which
Hmm.
you don't get, but if you can get some sleep, and I think rest, and I don't know if this is true, but my gut says that anxiety and stress is kind of a breast milk killer.
Wow,
I think,
interesting.
I mean, I don't know if that's
Yeah.
true, but I think if you're really hyper focused on I have to make more milk or my milk is going down or if you're just really anxious in general, which of course is a very common experience when you have a baby and a newborn baby or you're a first time parent, but just having awareness around it and trying to relax if you can, like
Mhm.
again, letting go. Like I my body's going to do what it's going to do just like it did with the birth process, and you some things you just can't control, and I think if you just acknowledge that, I think that stress and anxiety just really also can affect, I think, fertility issues. You know, if you
Mhm.
just really are focusing in, I think space and letting go, it's amazing what that can do. But that's just anecdotal. I don't have
Yeah.
any proof other than
Yeah.
ex- watching people.
I love that. That's so helpful. I want to honor your time, but I also want to give space if there's anything else you want to be sure to share, suggestions for relationships for beginning parents or maybe parents that have been on this journey for a while, just maybe looking at relationships and somatic work.
Hmm. I would say that, you know, there's different moments on the parenting journey. So there's the postpartum period, and then there's when you have a toddler, and then there's when you have older kids, and that in terms of couples, connecting or having rocky times at any point is normal. And there's definitely a time and a place for therapy, and there's a time and a place. I think that a lot of people don't talk about reconnecting it, don't talk about sex, don't talk about their bodies, and things can become very dire and very black and white quickly. And bringing this idea of playfulness and challenging, you know, re-looking at what your expectations are or what you think, how you think something should be, and readjusting and being playful and bringing lightness to it, and like this idea of getting curious about your partner in a different stage in life. Like
Mhm.
we are not where we were pre-kids. We are somewhere else. So how do we get curious about each other now, and how do you play and have fun, because things can get really serious really
Yeah.
really quick. And I love talking about that with people. People will look at me like, what do you mean play? Or what do you know, like everything becomes so focused on child raising that you forget. You forget.
Yeah.
And play, being fun, having fun for yourself as well, and being playful. As adults, we forget that.
I think that's so beautiful. And I could see how having a child is kind of an invitation into a world of play. It's like their whole reality is play for ideally, I mean, or largely. So I think
You learn so much.
yeah, yeah, I
And
love
I
that
would
idea.
say, oh, too, Sarah, that I don't just work with parents. I also
Mhm,
work with people that aren't parenting currently,
mhm.
or coming to me way down the parenting road when their kids are older. I also work with teens, which is an area that I love to be in. So just to say that as well, it's not just parents, but that's been my passion as of late.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Amazing. I love that. I'm curious, just thinking of approaching the idea of approaching a therapist. It's definitely a stereotype, but I see more females in general drawn or willing to go to therapy versus men seem to have a little bit more resistance in my perceived experience. I'm curious if you have any reflections on maybe normalizing therapy or ways that people could approach it in a more fun way that doesn't feel so serious. Because I think, you know, the work of a relationship, I think a lot of it, if you can get into that playful mind, that's where things get really expansive and you can connect on a deeper level. So I guess I'm just curious, like your experience with like gender and how can we normalize the idea of going to a therapist more?
Yeah. I think a lot of us, myself included, have come to therapy in moments of darkness and
Hmm.
a critical nature, or you hit rock bottom and then you make the call. And it's a courageous step. I mean,
Hmm.
I think for people that it's not in their culture to talk about themselves or to go to therapy, it can feel like, oh, you only go to therapy when you have to.
Hmm.
Um, I see it now. I didn't always used to, but I have been with my therapist for 12, 13 years. And I was terrified when I first made that step. And now I see it as an act of self care.
Hmm.
So sometimes I don't want to do it, but
Yeah.
I do it because I know that it's a moment that I'm taking. It's just for me. And I'm doing it for myself. So also, again, this idea of curiosity, like,
Hmm.
and I think that especially for parents, we can kind of lose our identity, or it can become all about being a dad or being a mom or a parent of a child, and that becomes your identity. So it can be a way that you can reconnect with yourself and get curious about who you are now.
Mm.
And I have a baby busting in on me.
Okay. Amazing. Yeah, I love that.
I can
That's
nurse her as we finish.
so perfect. Oh my gosh, what a beautiful little cutie. Who is that?
Mella,
Oh my gosh, those
almost 6
cheeks.
months.
Oh, she's so beautiful.
My
Oh.
dad is babysitting and he held off as long as he could.
Oh.
Do you mind if I nurse?
Oh, that's totally fine. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting the idea of going to a therapist. Like I view it almost as like spiritual hygiene. And I love that you bring curiosity to it. I feel similarly like I'm like, I don't know what I'm gonna say today. I don't know what my therapist is gonna say. Like but it's like kind of it's always
All
fun.
right. Sometimes you talk about something you didn't even like, where did that come from?
Yeah.
And I'm realizing I didn't address this idea of gender. I mean, I think that there's certain gender stereotypes or things that men are told about how they can express emotion or not. That's
Mm,
very confining. And
mhm,
we live in this magical place where I think from for people that identify as male, it's more acceptable to go to
mhm.
therapy than in a place, for instance, in other parts of our country.
Right.
But when it comes, I also think there's an important question, and I would say to listeners, when it comes to choosing a therapist, I would think, in terms of what gender therapist do you want, male, female, non-binary, Zer, anything. I would think about, first of all, who you could most comfortably talk with,
Mhm.
and who do you need to have, not just gender, but really you want a therapist where you can feel comfortable enough to talk.
Yeah.
Also, on the flip side, sometimes I think it can be really useful to think about what you need to work on.
Mm,
And if you're working on some wounding in particular, like, do you need to heal that with somebody of a particular gender, for instance? Like, if you're working on a tricky relationship with a parent,
mhm,
would it be actually useful? It might be hard, but would it be useful to heal that with,
mm,
for instance, if you're working on something with your father, would it be useful
mhm.
to heal that with somebody who's identifying as a man?
Oh, that's so
So,
interesting.
it could be harder, but there might be, if that's really what you're working with, then that might be where you need to be.
Mhm. Absolutely. Wow, that's a great suggestion. It's something I tend to just go to female therapists in general, but I did see one male therapist for a while, and it was really helpful, and it did feel energetically kind of different for whatever reason. Like I just feel like there were certain things I wouldn't want to talk about, or I would talk about in a different way if it was the same gender versus a different gender. So gender is so interesting how it shows up in our culture. And
Well, and different therapists will elicit different things too. Age can
yeah.
be a big one, and I tend to sometimes people that will come up for people, and I
Mhm.
totally understand, and it's all workable,
Mhm.
all information and good juice in the therapeutic relationship. It's all interesting to work with.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just curious, any last little things that you experienced at Naropa or through your trainings that you feel like people could maybe take with them in their day to day to have more mindfulness and more playful relationships?
I would say that just in terms of my training, that I just really believe and feel in myself and work in my practice with the mind body connection. And I people that aren't sure about what is somatic psychotherapy, what is dance movement therapy, really in its essence, I think all it is therapy that is based on the idea that the mind and the body are connected. So
Mhm.
anything that's happening in your mind, for instance, if you lost your job or if you had a death in the family, it's going to be playing out somehow, somewhere in your body. And if something has happened to your body, an illness or a birth or an injury, it's going to have an effect on your mind. So I find that there's times where both verbal and nonverbal interventions and ways to work are just in combination are essential in some ways, and particularly if you're feeling stuck or if you have felt stuck in therapy that's more talk oriented, that there's a whole nother piece and it can feel scary and foreign, and I totally understand that, and it's exciting and
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
Oh, I love that. That's so good. And I also want to turn people on to there's another podcast I love, which with a somatic therapist, the
Mm.
holistic life navigation.
Ooh.
I don't know. he- His podcast is so good, and it's basically all about somatic therapy, but through the lens of like creativity as well, and art and music and herbalism. And so it pulls in all these different things, but it always asking like, how do you feel in your body right now? Like kind of touching into that ideas at several points in each episode. And so listening to that podcast feels like therapy. So I just want to,
Yes, I'm gonna check it out.
yeah, it's really great. I'll send you a link to that.
Okay, thank you.
Oh my gosh.
Thank
So,
you so much for your questions and holding space.
oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for making time to talk about your work and your practice. And can you just remind people how they can find your work on the interweb?
Yes. So again, my name is LEXI CHATARA-MIDDLETON, and my private practice is spaciousgroundcounseling.com is the website. And you can also find me on the Sage Birth and Wellness website. I also have I'll drop this right now, but I have a article published on working with individuals and couples who are in non-monogamous relationships, which is a whole
Oh,
other
cool.
thing, but that's in the American Journal of Dance Therapy if anybody's interested in that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I would love to. I'll add a link to that in the show notes. That sounds amazing. That's good juice for a conversation in the future.
Area of interest. Yeah, another day.
Another day. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, Lexi, thank you so much for making
Thank you, Sarah.
and I hope you have a beautiful evening.
You too. You too. Awesome.
Have a
Take
great
care.
one. Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please be sure to like it, share it, leave a review, and leave some stars and whatnot. And if you really love the show, you can become a patron on Patreon. And I have a couple classes coming up in the future. Most recently, February 23rd, I will be teaching a class on emotional support for parents and focused on the perinatal time, but could be relevant for anyone. And be sure to join my mailing list. I have a lot of new things that I'm about to launch and release. So you can do that over at timeinthestudio.com and join the mailing list. Okay, thanks so much for being here. May our efforts benefit all beings. Take care of yourself. Lots of love. Toodles.